Greetings and welcome to our series of weekly devotionals. This week we're taking a look at some selected verses in Psalm 90, dealing with mortality and the finitude of our days, the time that we have here on earth. Well, a couple of Sundays ago, I was visiting someone in the hospital in the early afternoon. And one of the relatives was also in the hospital room with us, and she was speaking about some of the struggles and difficulties and hardships that her family had been experiencing recently. And she said, it will all work out in God's time. In God's time, God has a plan. Everything is on God's time. And she repeated that refrain over and over again. And it got me thinking about how we regard time. And it seems to me that in our culture, I don't know if this is a recent phenomenon or not, but time is a very valuable commodity. And it seems to me that most of us think, well, my time is really important. And sometimes we think, well, my time is more important than your time, or my time is more important than anyone else's time. And in a couple of verses that I'm going to share, verses 15 and 16, make us glad as many days as you have afflicted us, and as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be manifest to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. These verses, I think, at least subtly, allude to a difference between the way that we regard time as human beings and God's time. Now, the Greeks actually had two different words for those different expressions of time, chronos and kairos. Chronos was our time, linear time, the way we record time in minutes and hours and days. And kairos was the name for God's time. Now, in biblical theology, we think of God's time as not necessarily something we record in hours and minutes and days, but God's time is that time, those moments when God is active in the world, those moments when we recognize God's activity in the world, those moments, those days, those times when God's purposes are fulfilled. And so it's not necessarily a linear time, but it's a kind of time that can happen really any time. And I think as Christians, as people of faith, we are called to not only recognize God's time in our world, in our lives, but to participate in God's time, to participate in God's activity, God's purposes in our world. So, for example, this past Sunday, I really, after church, wanted to spend my time going home and watching football all afternoon. But God's time was spent in a hospital room, which I think in the end was a more meaningful expenditure of my time. I think focusing on God's time helps us to learn things like grace and sacrifice and patience and gratitude and generosity. And maybe, just maybe, learning that my time isn't any more important than others. Maybe my time isn't as important as I really think it is. Maybe what's more important is God's time. Amen.